Hello, welcome or welcome back. My name is Ari, and in today's video I want to talk about my favorite LGBTQIA plus authors. So, it's Pride Month. I know a lot of people want to read queer books by queer authors during Pride Month, and I also know that a lot of times what you think is a queer book may not actually be written by a queer author. Especially in romance, a lot of the men-loving men queer books are written by straight white women. So that's a problem. I don't like romance, so I'm not going to really recommend you any romance reads, but I am going to recommend you plenty of authors who are queer, and they don't necessarily write queer books, but here we go anyway. I'm gonna try to recommend them like in the order of the LGBTQIA plus thing, where it's like, these are the lesbian authors I like, these are the gay authors I like, but I don't know how well this is gonna work, but we're gonna try it. Let me scoot over here so I can stick some covers up over here. My first recommendation is Becky Chambers. She is one of my insta-buy all-time favorite authors, and my favorite book by her is A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, which is the first book in her Wayfarer series. She writes sci-fi, but it's like a warm mug of hot chocolate sci-fi. It's just such a pleasant reading experience. There's conflict, but it doesn't make you like feel anxious or feel bad, and just her writing gives you hope that people can be better than they are right now. So yeah, I love Becky Chambers. She is my comfort read. If I feel depressed or whatever, I'm gonna pick up a Becky Chambers book. Highly recommend. After that, I'm gonna talk about Sarah Waters. I've only read one of her books, but I've read it twice and I gave it 5 stars both times. Years and years apart. The book I've read by her is A Little Stranger. I'm eventually gonna read more books by her, but right now we got The Little Stranger. This is not queer in any way, shape, or form. Like, Sarah Waters herself is a lesbian, but her books are not, there's not really any romance involved. It's historical fiction with like a ghostly twist to it. So if you're looking to support an LGBTQIA plus author, but don't really want any sort of relationship or romance going on in the book, this might be a good choice for you. Also, she's just a great writer, so I recommend anybody read this anyway. My final one is Tamsin Muir, and my favorite book by her is Gideon the Ninth. Now, before somebody comes for me in the comments and is like, Tamsin Muir is married to a man, she's not a lesbian. She publicly identifies as a lesbian, which makes her a lesbian, so F off with those comments. I don't care. If she tells me she's a lesbian, she's a lesbian. Anyway, back to the book. Gideon the Ninth is lesbian necromancers in space. Like, that tagline describes the book perfectly. This one is a kind of a character-based narrative, so if you don't like Gideon's personality, you're probably not gonna like the book very much, but I love and adore Gideon's personality, so I loved this book so much. She's got the 3rd book in the series coming out later this year, and I am so excited to read it, and I have it on pre-order already. From there, let's move into G for gay. I apparently don't read a whole lot of gay male authors, so if you've got recommendations that aren't romance, leave them in the comments below. But for this, I'm going to play in David Slayton, who wrote a series where the first book is called White Trash Warlock, and I adore this book. It's so funny, but I picked this up off of NetGalley originally because it's about a warlock from Guthrie, Oklahoma. He grew up in a trailer park in Guthrie, Oklahoma. And if you're unaware, I grew up in Oklahoma, but not Guthrie. Anyway, this book is about this really sweet guy who's just super passionate about caring for other people, even though he grew up in a really poor homophobic, like, world. He still has this like great outlook, and he is a warlock, but he is like one of the least powerful warlocks. He's a human magic user, just doesn't have a whole lot of magic, but somehow he turns his lack of strong magic and his caring for people into like one of the most powerful things in the world. And it's very cool. Highly recommend. This is kind of like a fun mystery type fantasy. From there, let's move on to our bi authors, and I've got two for this section. So the first one is going to be Roxane Gay. I, again, have only read one book by Roxane Gay, and it was a short story collection called Difficult Women, which I very, very much enjoyed. And she has this, like, ability with her writing to make me want to write. And I've never wanted to be a writer. I love reading books. I don't particularly care for writing books, but when I read Roxane Gay, I'm like, I want to be a writer too. So to me, she's just a very inspirational writer, and I'm going to get to more of her stuff. I just adore what I have read so far. My other bi author is Chuck Tingle. I adore Chuck Tingle. He writes just super queer erotica, and he calls them tinglers. He's set in his tingler universe, and this man is so wholesome, so freaking wholesome, it's almost gross. His books are more like funny, light tonal, but really fun. I've read Trans Wizard Harriet Porber and the Bad Boy Parasophilus by him, which I bought because it was mocking J.K. Rowling, which I'm down for any day of the week, which was actually, I read this, didn't think that I would care much for it, just wanted to support an author who was actively speaking out against her turfish hate, and I ended up really, really liking this, and I was like, I want to read more Chuck Tingle. So I also picked up a horror novel by him called Straight, which was hilarious. It was very funny, but if you're going to take jokes against cishet people seriously, you may not want to pick up this book. Anyway, highly recommend Chuck Tingle. If you're not going to read his book, at least follow him on Twitter, because his Twitters are so like wholesome and motivational. Let's move on to the T authors for trans. I've got 3 trans authors that I've read books by, and I absolutely love those books. We're going to start out with Joss Lake, who is a trans man. Joss Lake wrote a sci-fi book called Future Feeling, which is kind of weird, but my kind of weird. Y'all know I like weird books. It's basically about a young trans man who accidentally puts a curse on some unsuspecting kid and has to save him with the help of the guy that he was actually going to curse. It was weird, but really cool. I think a lot of it is metaphorically speaking about coming out and choosing to transition, but I very, very much enjoyed it, and I don't read a whole lot about trans men. Usually the books that I see are popular are about trans women, so it was very, very cool reading something by a trans man, and very much enjoying it. Next up is Rika Aoki, and I read a book by her last year for the Sci-Fi Goodreads Choice. I had never really thought to pick up this book without Goodreads Choice, and I'm so glad I decided to read Sci-Fi Goodreads Choice last year, because this book was so good. Again, it's weird. I like weird things. This one follows a woman who made a deal with a devil to become like a truly masterful violinist. And to get out of her contract, she's got 49 years to present 7 souls in exchange for her own. So that's 7 years per 7 people, if I can math correctly. So when we joined her on this book, this is her very, very last year, and she has to present her final soul, and she's trying to find a likely candidate and comes across this super passionate trans violinist. And this young trans girl is just a beautiful violin player, but she doesn't really have any professional experience or any teaching, and she is treated horribly, like horribly. So if you don't like trans trauma, you may not want to read this, but I mean, it ends up getting better. I do promise that it ends up getting better. And this young, sad, to the point of suicidal girl is shown like love and caring from people around her who are actually important to her. So that in and of itself is a beautiful story, but there's also aliens who run a local donut shop. I mean, come on. Come on, that's perfect. The last trans author I'm going to mention is Akwaeke Emezi, and the book that I've read by them is The Death of Vivek OG. Now, this one isn't fantasy. This is just general fiction about being queer in a place where being queer is entirely illegal. This takes place in Nigeria and follows a young man named Vivek OG, and we know at the very beginning of the book that he has been murdered and his naked body was dumped on his mother's doorstep. And then from there we kind of go back into the past and retrace his life to see how he got there, and kind of like solve the mystery of his death for his mother. But that also presents the question of, does his mother really want to know what happened to him, or is she just grieving? The next letter is Q for queer. This is kind of a broad, general thing. A lot of these authors identify as queer and then as a different letter as well. So I couldn't find anybody who just specifically identified as queer and not something else. So I'm gonna skip over Q and just say that it pretty much covers every author that I have talked about already. Next, we're gonna talk about I, which is intersex, if you are unfamiliar with that one. And for I'm going to talk about Rivers Solomon. I have read all of Rivers Solomon's books, gave 2 of them 5 stars, and then 1 of them I personally didn't like, but it seems to be other people's favorite. Let's talk about my favorite book by them, which is Sorrowland. This is their most recent book. Like many of the books on this list and many of my favorite books of all time, this one is very, very weird. But this kind of follows somebody escaping a cult. This young girl is 7 months pregnant. She's been forced to marry a cult leader, and she runs away from the cult and has her children in the woods. And then we kind of follow her adventure, raising children wildly in the woods, and then her different romances that she has with various peoples throughout the rest of the book. And then there's like some weird magical element that it's very hard at the beginning to tell if this is something like in her head or if these are things that are actually happening, and how this magical element is actually connected back to the cult that she escaped from. I thought this was amazing. It's weird. It's got a lot of rep in it, and not just necessarily queer rep. We also have a diabetic character in here. But overall, this was really awesome. It also speaks in a really interesting way about gendering children and gives some really interesting like discussions and alternatives to just assigning a gender to your child at birth, instead of letting them choose their own gender as they get older and kind of like understand what gender is. So I thought those discussions were really, really cool. And if you're a parent or you're just interested in reading something along those lines in a fantasy setting, definitely recommend this book for you. Next up is A, which does not stand for ally, it stands for ace or asexual. Oh, people. And for this one, I'm going to talk about Darcy Little Badger, who wrote Alas Away. This actually is a middle grade book with an ace character. This has really like a magical storyline where there's no romance. The character is asexual, and it's very interesting to read, especially since you would think in a middle grade, why would we bring sexuality into a middle grade book? These children are way too young to be sexualized or assumed straight or gay or just attracted to anybody because these kids are in their preteens. But if you read a middle grade book, a lot of the times there's actually like some sort of romance or a crush or something like that. So it's very interesting to go into this book and read a book where that's addressed, but then the main character is asexual. It's not overtly part of the plot or anything like that, but it is addressed, and I thought that was very cool. Alas Away is about a young girl who can see ghosts and talk to ghosts, and she is trying to solve the mystery of her uncle's death. Don't let the cover of this fool you, because I had an issue with this one. This is set in the heat of Texas summer, so like 120 degrees outside, but for some reason the cover makes it look like it's snowing. But no, this also has indigenous rep to it. So Darcy Little Badger is Native American. Our main character, Alas Away, is Native American. From here, let's get into the plus part. Now there's plenty of pluses here, but people identifying outside of like the main LGBTQIA section, much harder to find, much harder to like specifically identify, especially because being a writer does not mean you have to define your sexuality publicly in any way. So the only author that I've read a lot of books from that I found in the plus section is polyamorous, and that is Laura K. Hamilton has identified herself publicly as polyamorous, and she speaks about it all the time. She's written 2 very polyamorous urban fantasy series. Anita Blake is her more famous one, who's Anita Blake Vampire Hunter, and then you have Mary Gentry series, which is like fae and fairies. Both series are really like that heavily romance urban thing. I like both of them, but I kind of like fell off reading them once they got like 16, 17 books deep. Mary Gentry, if you're interested in reading, there are 9 books in this series. I've read all of them. Mary Gentry is the niece of the Queen of Air and Darkness, and she fled the Fae Court years ago and is in hiding because her aunt wants to kill her, but she works in St. Louis, I believe, as a private detective. I believe Laura K. Hamilton lives in St. Louis because I think all of these books take place in St. Louis. So if you're familiar with St. Louis, this is kind of really cool to read because it features a lot of, you know, St. Louis staples. So if you're into fairy porn, this is old school fairy porn, and it's very pornographic. The other series that she wrote, this is probably her more popular series, is the Anita Blake series, and Anita Blake is a vampire hunter in St. Louis. She can reanimate the dead, and she also, you know, kills vampires for a living. But there's also like other creatures in there. So if you want like pornographic Buffy, I'm gonna say you probably will like the Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series, which, as you can see from the cover right here, starts with Guilty Pleasures. Alright, so those are all the queer authors that I have to talk about today. Thank you so much for watching this video, and let me know who your favorite queer authors are down in the comments below, and recommend me some books. Recommend me some new authors so I can expand my reading taste. If you don't have anything to say but still want to leave an emoji, leave me a queer emoji, so rainbow or any sort of pride flag, or just something that you associate with being queer down in the comments below. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.